Beneath the crowns and carefully staged smiles lies something far less polished, a vault of secrets, betrayals, hidden airs, and deals inked in silence. These aren't fairy tales, they're cover-ups, forged behind palace doors and buried in royal archives. For centuries, monarchies have ruled not just with power, but with omission. And tonight, we're unlocking what they never meant for you to see. This isn't just history, it's the family drama of empires, the scandals that shaped nations and vanished from the record. Welcome to 30 most shocking family secrets hidden by royals. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the secrets they're still trying to keep buried. While you're here, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you listening in the middle of the night like a true conspiracy enthusiast, or did this video ruin your morning coffee? Either way, you're in the right place. Let's begin. 1. Edward VIII, UK, and Nazi sympathies. At first glance, he was the kind of man empires are built around, charming, polished, photogenic, in that stiff 1930s way. He had the smirk of a man who'd never paid a bill, never heard a no that stuck. And yet, behind the well-tailored suits and tabloid headlines, Edward VIII was quietly building a legacy not of regal dignity, but of quiet disaster, and something far more dangerous than romantic scandal. The official story, the one polished and pressed into school books, goes like this. Edward abdicated the throne in 1936 because he loved an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson more than he loved the crown. That part at least is true, but buried beneath this soap opera is a far more uncomfortable secret. One that Buckingham Palace, MI5, and half the British establishment tried to smother under centuries of pomp, the former king's disturbing sympathy for Nazi Germany. For decades, it was written off as idle gossip, a few rogue opinions, the poor judgment of a bored royal. But then the Marburg files surfaced, a cache of captured German documents buried in a Hessian castle and unearthed after World War II. They contained something far worse than rumor, transcripts, telegrams, and letters hinting at full-blown collaboration. One document claimed that the Duke of Windsor, as Edward was known after his abdication, was no enemy to Germany. Another alleged that the Nazis believed reinstating him as king, following a successful invasion of Britain, would be desirable. Whether Edward himself pushed for this idea or merely entertained it over champagne is still debated, but the fact that high-ranking Nazis saw him as a potential puppet monarch is unsettling enough. The British government, understanding the PR disaster this could cause, responded in the most royal way possible. They covered it up. The Marburg files were kept secret until 1957, and even then only released in a heavily redacted form. Meanwhile, Edward was posted as governor of the Bahamas, a sunny exile in colonial camouflage, far from the European theatre. What really happened between the ex-king and the Third Reich remains a masterclass in controlled silence. Historians still argue over how deep his connections ran. Did he actually meet Hitler in hopes of a future alliance? Was he merely naive or dangerously sympathetic? Was Wallis herself a German informant, as some British intelligence reports later speculated? The royal household, predictably, has never commented on the record. What we do know is that Edward and Wallis stayed friendly with known Nazi sympathizers even after the war. They dined with fascists, expressed thinly veiled admiration for order and strong leadership, and seemed consistently more concerned with their personal reputations than the 85 million corpses Europe buried between 1939 and 1945. And in the end, perhaps that's the most damning trait of all, indifference disguised as diplomacy. The monarchy's decision to hide this chapter speaks volumes not just about Edward's allegiances, but about the institution's priorities. Public image, continuity, tradition, all protected at the cost of truth. But Edward's brush with fascism wasn't the only skeleton rattling around Windsor's marble halls. If bloodlines are the foundation of royalty, then one might ask, where did that blood come from? and who paid the price for it. 2. The UK royal family's ties to slavery. Royal tradition has always wrapped itself in velvet and silence. Ceremonial swords, bejeweled crowns, and decades-old pageantry distract the public from the fact that monarchy, at its core, is an inheritance of power. And like many inheritances, the British royal families came with blood money, more specifically the kind that crossed the Atlantic in chains. For a long time, this topic was a ghost at the banquet, visible only if you knew where to look. But recently, researchers have begun to unwind the threads, pulling the ornate curtains back to reveal something rather less picturesque than the changing of the guard. Hidden in the footnotes of colonial ledgers and inherited estates is a truth the British monarchy has long sidestepped: their financial, political, and personal entanglement in the transatlantic slave trade. The story doesn't begin with Queen Elizabeth II or King Charles III. It starts earlier, during the reigns of monarchs who were not merely passive beneficiaries of slavery, but active shareholders in the companies that built their wealth on it. King William III, for example, held stock in the Royal African Company, an institution that transported more Africans into slavery than any other single organization in history. Its logo? An elephant and castle topped with a crown. But even after the official abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, the royal involvement didn't just vanish. Instead, it evolved into silence, into compensation schemes that favoured former slave owners rather than the enslaved. When Parliament outlawed slavery, it didn't punish the wealthy for their participation. Instead, it paid them. British taxpayers, including descendants of enslaved people, were still repaying that compensation debt as recently as 2015. As for the royal family, they remained mysteriously uninvolved in this national reckoning, at least on paper. They didn't issue statements, they didn't open archives, and they certainly didn't volunteer the extent of their inherited investments. But investigative journalists and academic researchers have started doing the math. In 2023, documents surfaced showing that King Charles III's ancestors directly profited from plantations worked by enslaved people in Virginia, among other locations. It wasn't some distant association, it was embedded in the family fortune. And yet, the official palace stance has been curiously neutral, wrapped in vague acknowledgements and guarded phrasing. Charles has expressed deep regret over slavery's impact, but has stopped short of a full apology. The line between responsibility and guilt, between institution and individual, is navigated with the precision of a tightrope act, a performance perfected over generations. What makes this particularly haunting is how carefully the record was sanitized. The royal family's involvement wasn't necessarily erased. It was simply never said out loud. The grandeur of Windsor Castle never advertises its links to colonial sugar money. The imperial state crown, which sits atop monarchs at coronation, has never had to explain how much of the empire it represents was built on unpaid labor. In Britain's collective memory, the monarchy has been allowed to float above the messy particulars of empire, like a neutral witness in a crime scene it helped design. But if royalty demands reverence on the grounds of tradition, it also inherits accountability. You can't wear the jewels without owning the mine, and still money moves, quietly offshore beneath shell corporations and golden seals. Because if there's one thing more taboo than acknowledging how the monarchy was built, it's asking where the money goes now. And just like royal history, we're only scratching the surface. If you're still with us, take a second to subscribe. More secrets are coming, and trust me, they only get stranger. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight rabbit hole, lunchtime scandal binge, either way, you're among royalty now. 3. Offshore wealth of the UK monarchy. The British monarchy has always insisted it's above politics, above scandal, above scrutiny. But it has never claimed to be above finance, at least not out loud. That part is simply implied, folded into centuries of quiet accountancy, whispered trusts, and a stubborn refusal to itemize the silverware. Because behind every royal ceremony is a price tag, and behind that price tag is a curious question: who's paying, and where exactly is the money? For decades, the finances of the royal family have been shrouded in a kind of ceremonial fog, dense, polite, and entirely intentional. Officially, the sovereign grant, a publicly funded sum derived from crown estate revenues, keeps the monarchy afloat. But the real treasure isn't in those line-item reports. It's tucked away in trust funds, private estates, and, as revealed by a series of high-profile leaks, offshore financial havens. In 2017, the Paradise Papers, a massive leak of 13.4 million documents, cracked open the gilded vault, and what spilled out wasn't exactly criminal, but it wasn't flattering either. The Duchy of Lancaster, a private estate that provides income for the reigning monarch, had invested millions in offshore funds. One such investment was in a company that controlled Bright House, a rent-to-own business criticized for exploiting low-income families in the UK. That's right, while the monarchy projected itself as a symbol of national unity, its portfolio quietly profited off high-interest furniture loans to the country's working class. And that's just the paperwork that made it out. The Duchy of Cornwall, historically run by the Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, has also been scrutinised. A Guardian investigation found that the duchy held offshore interests in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, shielded behind complex legal structures. The monarchy defended itself with predictable vagueness. These were commercial investments, handled without the direct knowledge of the royals. But the distinction between not involved and willfully uninformed is a thin one, especially when the monarchy is built on symbolic purity. Here's the real twist: even when these investments come to light, the royals aren't breaking the law. They're merely playing by the rules written by people like them, for people like them. Because the United Kingdom and its vast network of overseas territories has long operated as a global hub for legal but ethically opaque wealth management. Shell companies, blind trusts, and nominee directors are all part of the game. And the royal family, despite its constitutional neutrality, is playing. The public is rarely invited to examine the ledger. Royal finances, especially private ones, are largely exempt from transparency laws. Freedom of information requests can't penetrate the sovereign's veil. Royal wills remain sealed, and when lawmakers try to bring palace finances under public oversight, they tend to find themselves outmaneuvered by quiet lobbying and constitutional shrugging. One hand waves at tradition, while the other signs paperwork in the Cayman Islands. For a family that insists it exists for the people, it's remarkable how little financial light reaches behind the throne. And maybe that's the real scandal, not just that the wealth exists offshore, but that it exists off limits. And yet, even this tangle of offshore ledgers and hidden interests pales in comparison to another kind of concealment, not of money, but of bloodlines. Because if the monarchy guards its cash so closely, imagine what it would do to hide something far more explosive: illegitimate children. 4. Secret marriages and illegitimate children in European dynasties. There's something oddly poetic about the royal obsession with bloodlines. After all, monarchy is one of the few institutions still pretending that genetics equals destiny. Lineage is everything. Not love, not competence, not character, just blood. The right kind, preferably blue, and traceable through a dizzying forest of titles and hyphenated surnames. But what happens when that bloodline, leaks? For centuries, royal families across Europe have operated like dynastic corporations, where marriages were mergers and offspring were living stock options. Public unions were arranged down to the embroidery. Private ones, however, were a different matter entirely. Hidden affairs, secret weddings, and the occasional child who mysteriously vanished from the historical record all were part of the unspoken tradition that kept royal reputations intact and succession lines conveniently tidy. Take Britain, for example. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 made it illegal for members of the royal family to marry without the sovereign's permission. Romantic, right? In reality, it was damage control disguised as dignity. Royals who fell in love with commoners, Catholics, or worse, foreigners, had to choose between exile and secrecy. Many chose the latter. Some quietly married in defiance, others never married at all, but maintained long-term partnerships out of the public eye. The results? Children who never made it into official portraits, spouses who died as companions, and a whole sub-history of half-acknowledged heirs and lost claims. It wasn't just a British problem. In Austria, Spain, France, dynasties from Habsburg to Bourbon to Saxe-Coburg, secret marriages were surprisingly common, though meticulously undocumented. There were whispered unions with ladies-in-waiting, mistresses elevated to unofficial consorts, and even entire side families kept hidden in country estates, safe from both scandal and the threat of legitimacy. Because in royal logic, the worst-case scenario isn't betrayal. It's a legitimate child born from the wrong womb. These aren't just romantic subplots. They had real geopolitical consequences. When you base your entire regime on hereditary succession, a single hidden child can become a crisis in waiting. Wars have started over lesser claims. Succession disputes, inheritance lawsuits, and even revolutions have roots tangled in these hidden genealogies. Sometimes these children were quietly paid off and relocated. Other times, they simply disappeared from public record, erased by the stroke of an archivist's quill. And still, the secrets slipped out. In the 20th century, DNA testing and modern journalism brought a few of these cases into the light. Scandalized biographies surfaced. Long-lost descendants claimed titles. Some were proven right, others were dismissed, often by institutions with a vested interest in maintaining the illusion of a spotless lineage. Even today, the full extent of royal extramarital offspring remains unknown, not just because of lack of evidence, but because of active concealment. Official archives are sealed, biographers are discouraged, courts dismiss lineage claims citing lack of standing, and the public, enthralled by the fairy tale, rarely stops to ask who didn't make it into the family photo. Because in royal families, legitimacy is not just a matter of birth, it's a matter of permission, and no secret threatens the monarchy more than the suggestion that love or lust once outranked protocol. But if a few hidden children can shake a dynasty, imagine what happens when the scandal moves from bedrooms to backrooms, from lovers to gambling tables, and the royal family finds itself not just morally compromised, but publicly exposed. 5. The UK Royal Baccarat Scandal, 1890s. When the British aristocracy gambles, it does so with decorum. Champagne instead of smoke, velvet tables instead of alley dice. But behind the satin and silver, the stakes have always been more than money. It's about reputation, secrecy, and the illusion of moral superiority. Which is exactly what made the Royal Baccarat Scandal of 1890 such a delicious catastrophe. It wasn't just a gambling scandal, it was a full-scale public unravelling of the moral theatre the monarchy had spent centuries performing. The key figure, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, a man who spent his younger years redefining the phrase "born to rule" into something closer to "born to recline in a private railway carriage with questionable companions and a cigar." By the time the scandal hit, he already had a reputation for indulgence. He was the kind of royal who saw duty as a necessary prelude to dinner. The setting was Tranby Croft, a country house in Yorkshire owned by the Wilson family, nouveau riche shipping magnates eager to rub elbows with actual nobility. The guest list was glittering, and one night, for lack of better entertainment, they decided to play baccarat, a card game technically illegal in Britain at the time. Legalities, however, have never stopped the aristocracy from enjoying itself. Among the guests was Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Gordon Cumming, a respected military officer and a man with a future still worth protecting. Unfortunately for him, multiple people at the table, including the Prince of Wales himself, accused him of cheating. The specifics remain murky. Some said he touched his counters suspiciously. Others claimed he manipulated bets. What matters is this: the accusation was made privately, and Gordon Cumming was asked to sign a document agreeing never to play cards again in exchange for silence. He signed it. End of story? Not quite. Word leaked, as it inevitably does when scandal has royal handwriting on it. Gordon Cumming, facing social ruin, did the unthinkable. He sued. The case became a national spectacle in 1891. For the first time in modern memory, the Prince of Wales was called to testify in open court. Newspapers across the country devoured the trial, which lasted 5 days and played out like a West End drama. Whispered alliances, crumbling alibis, and all of it under the cold gaze of public opinion. The verdict: the jury sided with the prince and the accusers. Gordon Cumming lost the case, and with it his reputation. But the royal family didn't exactly emerge unscathed. The idea that the heir to the throne had not only participated in illegal gambling, but had also helped hush up a scandal and then paraded into court with aristocratic arrogance, well, it didn't sit well with everyone. Queen Victoria was reportedly livid. The public was fascinated and vaguely repulsed. Parliament grumbled. But the real legacy of the scandal wasn't in what was proven, it was in what was revealed. That the monarchy wasn't immune to petty feuds, secret backroom deals, or embarrassing social entanglements. That behind the facade of moral rectitude stood a man who could lose at cards, then gamble with the truth to protect himself. And if they'd go that far over a card game, what else might they conceal behind the walls of royal privilege, especially when the stakes are far higher? Say national security, surveillance, and the quiet involvement of royals in the shadows of intelligence operations. 6. UK security and spying secrets involving royals. The image of the modern British royal family is that of polite detachment. They wave, they ribbon cut, they host dignitaries and garden parties with the slow, practiced efficiency of a well-rehearsed play. But beyond the teacups and balcony appearances lies a deeper, more covert relationship between the House of Windsor and the sprawling hidden machinery of the British security state, a relationship marked by secrets, sealed files, and a silence far more strategic than ceremonial. Contrary to popular belief, the royal family is not just a collection of figureheads in antique uniforms. Over the decades, members of the monarchy have quietly participated in classified military training, received confidential intelligence briefings, and in some cases walked dangerously close to the world of espionage itself. Let's start with Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh. His public role was that of a gruff naval officer turned ceremonial consort. But beneath the surface, he had long-standing ties to British intelligence circles. As a naval commander during World War II, he was privy to classified operations. In later decades, he maintained regular contact with MI6 and GCHQ leadership, not as a meddler, but as a trusted if unofficial liaison. His network was the kind of informal, deniable link that intelligence agencies value. Access without the accountability. Then there's the more recent case of Prince William, who, according to palace-approved reporting, underwent a secret 3-week placement with MI5, MI6, and GCHQ in 2019. Publicly, this was pitched as a sort of royal internship. In reality, it demonstrated how deeply embedded the monarchy remains in the British security apparatus. These weren't mere tours. He was trained in surveillance techniques, cyber threats, and national security operations. Not something your average duke does over spring break. And yet, while some royal engagements with intelligence are acknowledged in sanitized press releases, much remains hidden, especially when it comes to surveillance not by the royals, but on them. Throughout the 20th century, members of the royal family were subjects of covert observation by their own state. MI5 maintained files on several royals, particularly those who strayed from the carefully managed script of constitutional neutrality. Edward VIII, for example, was monitored long after his abdication due to his suspected Nazi sympathies. Princess Margaret, due to her social circle and occasional rebellious streak, drew attention as well. Even Queen Elizabeth II's private communications were, at times, considered of strategic interest, particularly during the height of the Cold War. These files are not easily accessed. The royal household has a unique arrangement with British intelligence agencies, a kind of mutual understanding that shields them from the level of transparency expected of even elected officials. 4. Requests are routinely denied. Royal archives are tightly controlled. Some documents relating to royal security are under seal until 2075 or longer. In other words, the public is invited to trust that all is well, without being permitted to verify that it is. And in moments of real tension, terrorist threats, political instability, cyber attacks, the royals are whisked away, briefed behind closed doors, and returned to the public as symbols of continuity. What is never discussed is how much they know or how much they've seen. Nor are we told what kinds of special forces training certain royals may have undergone. That's the point. The monarchy's mystique relies on its distance, but its survival, that depends in part on secrecy, the kind enforced not by tradition, but by classified protocol, which leads us to a different kind of royal secrecy, not about what royals did, but about what the institution prevents us from knowing. Not scandal, but structure, not tabloid, but law, because sometimes the biggest secret isn't a mistake hidden in the past, it's a system designed to keep the future off limits. 7. Cover-ups of royal wills and lobbying. In most families, when someone dies, their will becomes a matter of public record. It's a legal transparency measure, part of the small print of accountability. But in royal circles, transparency is not tradition. It's a threat, which is why, for over a century, the wills of senior British royals have been sealed, hidden from public scrutiny, locked away not just from journalists and historians, but from the very citizens the monarchy claims to represent. This isn't a quirk of protocol, it's a calculated exception carved into British law, and one the monarchy has lobbied aggressively to protect. It started in 1910, when the will of Prince Francis of Teck, Queen Mary's brother, raised uncomfortable questions. He had bequeathed valuable family jewels, not to the royal vaults, but to a mistress. This minor scandal rippled through the royal court, and the lesson was learned swiftly. Don't let the public read the paperwork. Ever since, royal wills have been quietly sealed by judges in secret hearings without public notice, and kept from view for 90 years, sometimes longer. When Prince Philip died in 2021, his will was locked away for at least a century. It's not just about shielding sentimental trinkets. Royal wills could reveal the scope of private wealth, undisclosed relationships, or financial arrangements that contradict the carefully curated image of regal modesty. The monarchy receives vast sums from public funds, including the sovereign grant, and yet insists that its private wealth is, well, private. Sealed wills are the legal firewall that protects that fiction. But wills are only one piece of the puzzle. The bigger, more structurally corrosive secret lies in how the monarchy actively shapes legislation, behind the scenes, with no debate, no public record, and no consent. The mechanism is known as Queen's Consent, now King's Consent, a constitutional requirement that certain bills affecting the Crown's interests must be approved by the monarch before they can be debated in Parliament. On paper, it's ceremonial. In practice, it has become a powerful tool of hidden influence. Documents obtained by investigative journalists in recent years revealed that Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles used this mechanism to secretly lobby ministers, successfully in many cases, to change proposed laws. These interventions weren't about constitutional minutiae. They affected everything from inheritance tax exemptions to environmental protections to business transparency. In one instance, Charles secured an exemption for his private estates from a law that would have required landlords to improve energy efficiency, all while publicly championing climate action. None of this was disclosed at the time. Parliament quietly rewrote language. Bills were amended in the shadows, and when questions were asked, the palace declined to comment, citing constitutional neutrality, the same neutrality it had just lobbied to compromise. This isn't scandal in the traditional sense. It's not about an affair or a headline-grabbing outburst. It's the slow, methodical shaping of a system where the rules don't apply evenly, where a family at the apex of the national mythos can operate with legal privilege, bureaucratic immunity, and political invisibility. And what makes it more unsettling is how ordinary it has become. Secrecy in the royal ecosystem isn't the exception. It's the operating system. Still, even this level of institutional cloaking pales next to the dynastic strategies of old Europe, where royal marriages weren't just political theatre, but covert operations, arranged not to delight the public, but to outmaneuver enemies, because behind every royal wedding cake is a quiet, bloodless war. 8. Europe. Dynastic power marriages manipulated for politics. Every royal wedding has a narrative. A nation rejoices. The bells ring. The couple smiles photogenically from a balcony, while tabloid headlines drip with adoration. But the real story, especially in Europe's older monarchies, rarely begins with romance. It begins in backrooms, with maps, not love letters, with bloodlines, not butterflies. Because historically, royal marriages were never about affection. They were tactical maneuvers in a geopolitical chess game, with Europe as the board and human lives as the pawns. One of the more revealing and quietly treacherous examples is the affair of the Spanish marriages in the 1840s. At a glance, it was just another continental marriage arrangement. A princess here, a duke there. But beneath the polite language of dynastic unity was a plot as tangled as any Cold War spy novel, involving France, Britain, Spain, and a centuries-old obsession with controlling thrones without firing a single shot. At the heart of it was Queen Isabella II of Spain, a teenage monarch under pressure from every major power in Europe to marry someone useful. France wanted her aligned with their interests. Britain, ever wary of French expansion, wanted her not aligned with France. Both wanted access to the Spanish crown. Nobody cared what Isabella wanted. Enter Louis-Philippe I, the King of the French, who orchestrated a bold and secretive political coup. He rushed through Isabella's marriage to her cousin, Francisco de Assis, a match that satisfied almost no one and was widely viewed as a French-friendly compromise. But the real trick was in the secondary move. Louis-Philippe simultaneously arranged for his own son to marry Isabella's younger sister, Luisa Fernanda, a double play. If Isabella failed to produce an heir, which many suspected was likely due to the reportedly frail health and ambiguous preferences of her husband, the French prince would be next in line to the Spanish throne through his wife. This diplomatic sleight of hand infuriated the British, who had been pursuing their own preferred match for Isabella, a Coburg prince related to Queen Victoria. The British Foreign Secretary denounced the French move as underhanded. Queen Victoria herself wrote scathing letters. And just like that, an entire generation of royal diplomacy, supposedly founded on civility and mutual respect, was revealed to be little more than secret horse trading in velvet gloves. The consequences were long-lasting. The maneuver poisoned Anglo-French relations for years and destabilized Spain internally. Isabella's reign turned turbulent. The marriage was a failure. Uprisings followed. In the end, both queens, Victoria and Isabella, ruled long enough to see their family alliances crack under the very pressures those marriages were meant to avoid. What made it a secret wasn't that it happened. The marriages were public. The secret was how deliberately the players manipulated perception, presenting a scripted version of royal destiny while executing a realpolitik operation behind closed doors. The scandal wasn't in the names on the invitations, but in the intent. This wasn't an isolated case. Europe's royal archives are full of similar stories: strategic engagements, preemptive annulments, sibling swaps, marriages arranged and rearranged with all the warmth of a border negotiation. Sometimes these dynastic unions brought peace. More often, they simply delayed war or shifted its costs to a different generation. But if European royalty learned to manipulate marriage for power, monarchies elsewhere found subtler ways to obscure their dealings. In some royal households, the veil of secrecy wasn't stitched into wedding veils. It was woven into bank transfers, property portfolios, and palatial renovations the public was never meant to see. Because in some parts of the world, the most explosive royal secret isn't who they married, it's what they spent. 9. Middle East, hidden finances and expenditures by royal households. Royalty in the Middle East wears its wealth visibly. Golden palaces, fleets of private jets, state visits with 1,000-person entourages, and wedding ceremonies that stretch across time zones. But as much as this opulence dazzles the public eye, it also distracts from a deeper, more concealed truth. What you see is only the tip of a carefully submerged iceberg of wealth, power, and financial secrecy. Unlike their European counterparts, who now operate within the constraints of constitutional monarchy and democratic oversight, at least theoretically, many Middle Eastern royal families still rule, not just ceremonially, but absolutely. Their word is law. Their fortune is the state's fortune, and the line between personal spending and national budget is in many cases non-existent. That's not a metaphor, it's a budgetary structure. Public records on royal spending are almost impossible to come by in many Gulf countries. Parliamentary systems are either absent, symbolic, or selectively suspended. Independent auditing, often discouraged. Freedom of information laws, practically unheard of, which means that palace expenditures, personal investments, and sovereign wealth management are all managed behind a screen of absolute discretion. Behind the curtain of nationhood sits a checkbook no one is allowed to read. Consider the sovereign wealth funds, the financial lifelines of oil-rich monarchies. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the UAE's Mubadala, and Qatar's Investment Authority are among the largest in the world, each worth hundreds of billions of dollars. On paper, they are national entities. In practice, they often operate with oversight that is either exclusively royal or entirely opaque. The line between personal and public wealth is blurred by design, and that wealth is not static. It moves. It purchases stakes in Premier League football clubs, tech startups in Silicon Valley, European banks, art auction houses, surveillance companies, and media networks. Some of it goes to philanthropic fronts, some to shell corporations. Much of it disappears into international real estate portfolios, skyscrapers in London, mansions in Beverly Hills, resorts in the Maldives. Every acquisition is polished and publicly celebrated. The structure behind it, largely untraceable. Occasionally, the veil slips. Leaked documents and financial probes, such as the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, have revealed offshore trusts linked to royal family members, questionable transactions, and financial intermediaries moving funds across jurisdictions with breathtaking speed. But these are fragments, a glimpse through a keyhole into a palace filled with locked rooms. It's not just the amount of wealth that's hidden, it's the implications of how it's used. Massive public projects, stadiums, cities, mega malls are often state-funded but routed through royal-owned construction firms. The result is a closed loop of wealth generation, where the state pays the monarchy to develop the state. Procurement processes are rarely transparent. Critics and investigators who dig too deeply have, in multiple cases, found themselves facing legal consequences or vanishing from public discourse altogether. Still, the illusion of modernity is carefully maintained. These monarchies frequently position themselves as progressive, patrons of the arts, sponsors of green energy, partners in global diplomacy. But behind the glowing skyline photos lies a ledger that no citizen has the right to examine. In the absence of transparency, myths fill the vacuum. Stories of secret vaults, rumors of private islands not listed on maps, whispers of personal jets fitted like palaces, or museums closed to the public because the art inside is too politically charged. Some of these are true, others are exaggerations, but the real scandal isn't in the extravagance, it's in the silence. And if the monarchy can hide wealth behind a nation's flag, what else can it hide behind the mask of tradition? Because in other parts of the world, the royal secrets aren't just about what's spent, but what's disappeared. Names, titles, entire reigns lost behind closed doors and whispered into exile. 10. Asia, royal scandals of secret relations, abdications, and power struggles. In Asia, royal power often doesn't vanish, it recedes. It steps back behind the veil of temples, tradition, or constitutional reform, retreating just far enough to appear symbolic, while remaining deeply entangled in the state's nervous system. And when scandals surface, as they inevitably do, they rarely explode in the tabloids like they might in the West. Instead, they dissolve, censored, redacted, or buried in ceremony. Yet behind the lacquered doors of palaces from Southeast Asia to East Asia, stories of hidden abdications, forbidden relationships, and discreetly managed coups tell a very different tale. In several Asian monarchies, abdication is framed as a personal decision, a tired sovereign seeking spiritual retreat or citing health concerns. But the public version is often the sanitized product of intense internal pressure, political friction, or outright family strife. The most public case in recent years was Emperor Akihito of Japan, who stepped down in 2019, the first Japanese emperor to do so in over 2 centuries. On the surface, it was a graceful gesture, but behind the scenes it was preceded by years of bureaucratic resistance and complex negotiations. The Japanese imperial family, despite its symbolic role, remains under the strict control of government protocols, unable to marry freely, speak openly, or manage its own image. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, monarchies have walked far closer to the fire. In Thailand, for instance, the royal institution is constitutionally protected by some of the world's strictest lèse-majesté laws, criminalizing almost any discussion of the monarchy that isn't reverent. As a result, much of what transpires within the royal circle is effectively immune to public scrutiny. But even in silence, rumors echo. There have been reports, difficult to verify and dangerous to publish, of internal rivalries, dramatic demotions, and quietly orchestrated reshuffles of royal consorts and advisors. In 2020, a high-profile noble consort was removed from her role, then later reinstated, all within the context of palace announcements that offered no details and tolerated no questions. In Cambodia, the monarchy has seen a different kind of concealment, not scandal so much as erasure. King Norodom Sihanouk famously abdicated not once but twice, first in 1955 and then again in 2004, amidst a whirlwind of political pivots, Cold War alignments, and shifting allegiances. His role was less royal figurehead, more geopolitical chess piece. Each abdication was framed as a personal sacrifice for the nation, yet both were steeped in opaque power plays and diplomatic pressure. The Cambodian monarchy today functions within a constitutional framework, but its past is marked by behind-the-scenes maneuvering that blurred the line between retreat and removal. And then there are the relationships, the romantic kind. In several monarchies, particularly where traditional values intersect with rigid public expectations, royal unions have become pressure cookers. Relationships with foreigners, commoners, or individuals outside religious or ethnic norms have been quietly dissolved or hidden entirely. In some cases, royal heirs have abdicated their claims to the throne in order to marry partners deemed unsuitable. These exits are often framed as noble acts of love, but the truth is more complicated, a blend of family disapproval, public image management, and political optics. Documentation, as always, is scarce. Many of these stories live in rumor, whispers between courtiers, strange gaps in official timelines, or sudden disappearances from public life. Censorship laws, cultural taboos, and a tight grip on national media prevent deeper investigations. What we're left with is a fog of half-truths, broken timelines, and suspiciously smooth transitions. Still, the pattern is unmistakable. Royal power in Asia may dress itself in robes of ancient tradition, but its secrets are decidedly modern, crafted with the tools of surveillance, censorship, and spin. And yet, if disappearing a consort or rewriting a love story is relatively easy when you control the media, imagine what can be hidden when entire histories have been rewritten, not to protect hearts, but to shield empires. Because in the next chapter, royal secrets don't just involve individuals, they entangle entire continents, shadowed by the long arm of colonialism and the erased abuses of power. 11. Africa, royal houses, colonial legacies, and hidden abuses. In Africa, the story of royalty is not always one of crowns and carriages. It is more layered, shaped by centuries of shifting power, colonial interference, spiritual authority, and resistance. Some royal families survived the colonial wave by aligning with it. Others were dismantled, co-opted, or reduced to ceremonial figures for tourists and textbooks. But behind the historical trauma and the diplomatic reinventions lie secrets, uncomfortable, unspoken, and often deliberately erased, about what these royal houses did to maintain influence, even after being formally dethroned. Long before European colonizers set their sights on African kingdoms, royalty was a deeply entrenched structure across the continent. Empires like Benin, Mali, Ashanti, and Zulu were powerful, politically complex, and economically strategic. But with the arrival of European powers, British, French, Portuguese, Belgian, the rules of royal power changed. In some cases, kings and chiefs were forcibly removed. In others, they were absorbed into the colonial system and used as intermediaries, paid in titles and privileges to control their own people on behalf of foreign empires. This collaboration was not always reluctant. Some African royals actively worked with colonial powers, signing treaties that handed over land, access to resources, or labor, often in exchange for protection, weapons, or recognition. These secret deals were almost never disclosed to the populations affected by them. Oral histories speak of land given away without asking, of tribes relocated for plantations, and of young men conscripted into imperial armies through royal decrees delivered in the name of peace. The colonial authorities preferred it that way. A handful of compliant royals were easier to manage than a whole population. But the consequences were enormous. Generations of Africans were subjected to forced labor, resource extraction, and cultural erasure, not always by foreign officials, but by their own rulers, acting under colonial incentives. These chapters remain buried in local archives, barely discussed in official histories. The narrative of royalty as victims of colonialism is easier to digest. The reality that some were complicit is harder to swallow. Even after independence movements swept the continent in the mid-20th century, many of these royal families retained informal influence. In countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, traditional rulers still wield power in land disputes, community leadership, and local governance. Yet their histories are often edited for public consumption. The records of abuses, forced marriages, land seizures, manipulation of colonial courts rarely make it into museum exhibits or royal press releases. In some cases, royal families accumulated secret wealth through these practices. Valuable land holdings, mineral rights, and international investments remained in royal hands, often hidden under foundations or front companies. Without the scrutiny of democratic institutions and protected by layers of tradition and reverence, these fortunes grew quietly, and behind the economics lies something even more fragile: identity. Many African royal families have reinvented themselves as custodians of culture, keepers of tradition, or spiritual leaders. But that image, too, is selective. It filters out the parts where royal decrees broke communities apart, where sacred symbols were sold to colonial collectors, where power was preserved through silence, not service. There are stories, spoken in hushed tones, of royals who exiled dissenters, rewrote genealogies to erase rivals, or aligned themselves with colonial officers to suppress resistance movements. These stories rarely make it into official ceremonies, but they live on, passed down in fragments, clues hidden in folklore and family feuds. And while some of these monarchies have faded into historical memory, others are quietly staging comebacks, not just in traditional roles, but in politics, business, and diplomacy. Their power never fully disappeared. It just adapted, which raises a different kind of question. If royals can rewrite history to erase betrayal, what else might they bury when the threat isn't political, but personal? Because in many royal households, it's not foreign alliances that vanish, it's people. 12. Suppressed deaths and disappearances in royal families. Royalty, for all its ceremony and spectacle, is at its most powerful when it controls the narrative, especially when that narrative involves the inconvenient disappearance of a family member. Throughout history, royal households have gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve the illusion of stability. Monarchies, after all, thrive on lineage, on an unbroken line stretching back into myth. But when someone goes missing from that line, dies under suspicious circumstances, vanishes from records, or is simply erased from mention, the silence around them tends to echo louder than any royal anthem. The idea of vanishing royals might sound like the stuff of historical fiction, but it's a pattern that's persisted across continents and centuries. In many cases, the exact truth has never been fully recovered. Only fragments remain. A name removed from succession lists, a portrait hastily stored in a basement, a death announced months or years after it actually occurred, rewritten to sound appropriately dignified. Royal families, it turns out, are remarkably adept at tidying up a bloodline. One of the most famous examples, and one that still invites speculation, is the fate of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia. Officially executed with her family during the Bolshevik Revolution, rumors persisted for decades that she had escaped. Imposters emerged, conspiracy theories flourished, and while DNA evidence later confirmed the deaths of the entire Romanov family, the fact that it took nearly a century to do so speaks to how effectively a royal disappearance can captivate and confuse. But not all suppressed deaths are shrouded in revolutionary chaos. Some happen quietly, behind palace walls, under circumstances never fully explained. There are numerous instances in European and Asian monarchies where younger siblings, cousins, or extended royal family members were sent away to distant estates, monasteries, or private clinics and never heard from again. Sometimes it was because of illness or disability. Sometimes political usefulness simply ran out, and sometimes they knew too much. In one case, a Middle Eastern royal family was rumored to have quietly relocated a prince who had shown interest in political reform, only for his death to be announced years later with little detail and no investigation. In another, a Southeast Asian royal disappeared during a period of intense internal power struggle. His name remains a taboo topic within the national media. In both stories, the public narrative was a blank page, and the palace saw no reason to fill it. The suppression isn't always complete. Sometimes it takes the form of strategic omission, a relative never introduced at public events, a child referenced once in passing and then never again. The royal biography glosses over the timeline. The photo album skips a page, and over time, absence becomes its own form of presence, a silent question hanging in the air, too dangerous to answer directly. What drives this vanishing act is not always malice. Often it's about control. A dynasty can tolerate many things, scandals, affairs, even financial leaks, but not unpredictability. A rogue family member with independent ideas, inconvenient behavior, or a claim to the throne that complicates the official version of events, easier to remove than rehabilitate. And once someone has been removed, whether by exile, concealment, or unspoken death, the machinery of monarchy kicks in to close the gap. The portraits are recropped, the line of succession adjusts, the press receives a carefully worded statement or none at all. But where do these erased royals go in the public imagination? Often they resurface in folklore, whispered as ghosts, saints, or legends of a family's shame. Other times they inspire questions that refuse to die. What did they know? Why did they vanish? Who decided their story was too dangerous to be told? And if a royal can be erased entirely, what about those whose existence was never even acknowledged to begin with? Because before someone can disappear, they must first be seen. And in some palaces, entire generations of illegitimate or secret offspring were never permitted even that. 13. Illicit relationships and secret offspring across monarchies. In monarchies, nothing matters more than the family tree, not the actual family, but the idea of it. Clean lines, legitimate heirs, carefully choreographed marriages. It's less a tree, more a blueprint. But blueprints can be altered, and over centuries, royal households around the world have developed a remarkably consistent method for managing affairs of the heart that don't follow protocol, deny them, erase them, or quietly tuck the consequences into someone else's household. Across continents and generations, royal families have engaged in relationships that weren't just frowned upon, they were unspeakable. Affairs with commoners, artists, courtiers, political enemies, and sometimes even servants, each one posing a threat not just to the royal's reputation, but to the entire structure of succession. Illegitimate children, once acknowledged, could raise questions of inheritance, loyalty, and entitlement. So the answer was simple: don't acknowledge them. Europe, predictably, wrote the first manuals on this. French kings were particularly prolific, with entire wings of Versailles practically humming with whispered liaisons. Louis XIV had numerous children by multiple mistresses, some of whom he legitimized, others of whom were quietly absorbed into the nobility or removed from history altogether. In Britain, King Charles II famously acknowledged more than a dozen illegitimate children, but his heirs never made it into the line of succession, a choice not just of policy, but of survival. But those were the lucky ones, the acknowledged few. In many royal households, particularly in Catholic monarchies or those with strict bloodline traditions, such children were denied entirely. Raised by distant relatives, hidden in convents, or shipped off to foreign lands with generous endowments and strict silence clauses. Some weren't even given surnames. Their existence was a liability, their presence a political inconvenience. It was easier to pretend they never existed than to rewrite the family tree. In some Asian dynasties, the secrecy was more systemic. Certain emperors and kings were rumored to have fathered children with concubines or palace attendants, but due to strict rules around lineage and legitimacy, these offspring were never granted public roles, even if everyone inside the palace knew their names. In many cases, they were folded into the bureaucracy or married off quietly, their royal parentage reduced to a hushed rumor passed down through generations. The story repeats in the Middle East, where royal families operate with immense privacy. Here, alliances are as much about religious expectations as political calculations. A relationship outside the accepted bounds, particularly one producing a child, is treated not just as a scandal, but as a threat to national image. Children born of such unions are often sent abroad, their connections erased. Occasionally, stories emerge, someone claiming royal blood, a quiet settlement, a mysteriously well-funded education. Proof, however, remains elusive, and that's by design. Even in modern times, DNA testing and investigative journalism have tried to pierce these walls of silence. Some have succeeded. A few long-denied children have been acknowledged, lawsuits filed, settlements paid. But for every public revelation, there are a dozen more that remain buried beneath layers of protocol, denial, and generational omerta. What's especially ironic is how these hidden relationships humanize royalty. They reveal them not as divine figures, but as deeply flawed individuals, ruled by passion, insecurity, and impulse. And yet, those very traits are the ones monarchies are built to hide. The entire institution depends on maintaining an image of control, of restraint, of flawless heredity. There's no room in that image for surprise heirs or inconvenient love stories. But what happens when a royal secret isn't just emotional, but existential? When the scandal isn't about who someone loved, but about who was forced to leave the throne? Because while passion may threaten royal bloodlines, the deeper fear has always been disobedience. And in some kingdoms, the price for disobedience is a throne abandoned in silence. 14. Hidden abdications and forced resignations. When a monarch steps down, the official story is usually polished until it gleams: personal health, public duty, the burden of age, a quiet bow from the stage, dignified, poetic. But if you read between the lines, and more importantly behind them, the picture often changes. Abdications are rarely acts of free will. More often, they are the final chapter of a conflict already lost, quietly rewritten to avoid embarrassment. Royalty, after all, is an institution obsessed with continuity, and there's nothing less convenient than a monarch who won't or can't continue. The word abdication itself carries a kind of whisper. It implies scandal, instability, a break in the royal line, which is why so many of them are shrouded in euphemism. Retirement, transition, voluntary withdrawal. But the facts behind these moments often reveal something very different. Forced deals, backroom ultimatums, and soft coups negotiated over antique furniture. Take King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom, perhaps the most famous abdication in modern royal history. The official line is that he gave up the throne for love, a fairy tale inversion. But the more honest version is less romantic. Edward's political views, his lack of discipline, and his deeply problematic associations with foreign powers had alarmed his government. His relationship with Wallis Simpson wasn't just controversial, it was convenient. It gave the establishment the excuse they needed to push him out without creating a constitutional crisis. And it worked. The story became about romance, not treason, and the monarchy survived. But Europe isn't the only place where royalty has been quietly reshuffled. In Malaysia, King Mohammed V stunned the country when he became the first monarch in the nation's history to abdicate in 2019, just 2 years into his term. No official reason was given. Rumors swirled of an overseas marriage, health concerns, political tensions. The palace declined to elaborate. The silence was louder than any statement. Japan's Emperor Akihito, as previously mentioned, stepped down in 2019, the first Japanese emperor to do so in over 2 centuries. Framed as an act of humility and reflection, his resignation followed years of private lobbying for the right to retire, as imperial duties became more ceremonial and rigid. The government was initially resistant. Abdication in Japan was historically associated with political instability. Eventually, special legislation was passed. The emperor left the throne, not by divine right, but by bureaucratic negotiation. In less publicized monarchies, those in the Middle East and parts of Africa and Asia, Abdications or royal removals are even harder to trace. Some rulers simply vanish from public life. No explanation, no transition. A new heir steps forward and the story resets. Often these are orchestrated by family factions, political advisors, or foreign pressures. The displaced monarch, if they speak at all, does so from exile or not at all. What connects all these cases is the choreography, the way chaos is turned into calm, the way a royal exit, no matter how messy, is presented as voluntary, inevitable, serene. But the real reason for the resignation, whether it's political pressure, personal scandal, or a palace power struggle, rarely makes it into the history books. And if even kings and emperors can be quietly dethroned by whispers and paperwork, what about the secrets they take with them? Especially those involving allegiances not to family or country, but to foreign regimes. The kind of relationships that leave no crown behind, only questions. 15. Secret alliances with extremist or foreign powers. For monarchies, survival often depends not just on tradition, but on adaptability. In times of war or upheaval, this has occasionally meant forming alliances with questionable regimes or adopting positions that, decades later, would be politically radioactive. These relationships, often unspoken, undocumented, or officially denied, weren't always about ideology. Sometimes they were about convenience, sometimes about leverage, and occasionally they were about desperation. Few examples loom as large or as unsettling as the relationship between Edward VIII, after his abdication, the Duke of Windsor, and Nazi Germany. His ties to the regime weren't merely the subject of salacious rumor. They were, as revealed in the Marburg files decades later, disturbingly real. While Britain was preparing for war, Edward was reportedly entertaining back-channel communications with Hitler's government. Nazi officials viewed him as a sympathetic figure, potentially a future puppet monarch if Germany successfully invaded Britain. This wasn't fringe theory. It was written in cables, passed between high-ranking Nazi officials and quietly retrieved by Allied intelligence after the war. And yet, despite the gravity of those documents, the story was largely smothered. The British government kept the files secret for over a decade, releasing them only in heavily redacted form. The royal family never issued a statement. The press, trained in the etiquette of discretion, largely moved on. The Duke lived out his life in a luxurious exile, giving interviews about fashion, not fascism. But the Windsor case is not unique. Across Europe and beyond, there are instances where monarchies maintained relationships, covert or otherwise, with controversial regimes. During the Cold War, several royal households in the Middle East and Asia forged quiet pacts with both Western and Soviet powers, depending on who was offering protection, arms, or economic backing. These weren't always betrayals. Sometimes they were hedges, calculated alignments meant to preserve the throne at any cost. In Spain, for example, General Franco's regime relied heavily on royal symbolism even while abolishing the monarchy in practice. Franco later restored the throne in the form of King Juan Carlos III, hoping to secure continuity and legitimacy for his political legacy. The king, while ultimately steering Spain toward democracy, began his reign as a carefully selected figurehead of a dictatorship. The complexity of that alliance is often underplayed in public narratives. In some monarchies, even the question of alignment remains murky. Royal family members are occasionally seen attending diplomatic events hosted by regimes with questionable human rights records, gestures that blur the line between ceremonial presence and implicit approval. When challenged, the palace response is almost always the same: no comment, or the visit was apolitical. But power is never truly apolitical, and the alliances formed in quiet rooms with foreign generals, intelligence officers, or political strongmen can leave stains that official biographies never mention. Because if a crown can survive by aligning itself with a foreign regime, what might it hide within its own walls? What deals are struck not across borders, but behind gates, not with governments, but with ghosts of scandal buried under chandeliers and stone. 16. Hidden scandals around royal residences. Royal palaces are designed to impress. Towering facades, endless corridors, velvet-draped drawing rooms soaked in symbolism. Every chandelier, portrait and marble statue whispers a story of permanence. These residences are not just homes, they're stages, carefully lit, relentlessly guarded, and always shown to the public at just the right angle. But behind the postcard images and guided tours, royal estates have long concealed more than state secrets. They've hidden entire chapters of scandal, impropriety, and quiet controversy, the kind that doesn't show up in glossy royal documentaries or travel brochures. Some of these secrets are architectural in nature, quite literally built into the walls. From Versailles to Windsor to obscure desert palaces, royal households have favoured design features that allow them to separate public image from private reality. Hidden staircases, secret wings, and concealed passageways have been used not just for security or privacy, but to allow meetings, affairs, or departures to occur away from curious eyes. The stories vary, but the pattern remains. If there's a back door, someone eventually uses it. In Britain, multiple palaces and royal estates have been quietly updated, repurposed, or even shut down entirely when their reputations became inconvenient. One such case involved the infamous Fort Belvedere, the country house where Edward VIII signed his abdication. After the scandal, it was scrubbed from public royal life, handed over to lesser-known royals, and largely erased from the narrative. The house itself became a symbol of what the monarchy prefers not to remember, that a king once chose love, or at least obsession, over duty. The scandal was in the act, yes, but also in the building where it occurred. Other royal residences carry more subtle stains. There have been long-standing rumours, some supported by careful journalism, others by persistent local gossip, of abuse of power within estate grounds, exploitative labour practices, misuse of public funds, questionable security incidents that never made it to the press. In some cases, employees have come forward with concerns about toxic work environments or mismanagement, only for the allegations to vanish into legal silence. NDAs are common, out-of-court settlements even more so. In the Middle East and parts of Asia, where royal palaces are sometimes more fortified compounds than ceremonial homes, the secrecy runs deeper. Official photographs are often staged. The number of rooms, residents, and even buildings within the compound is rarely disclosed. Some palaces function as entire mini-states, with their own internal rules, private guards, and invisible personnel hierarchies. When scandals happen, whether involving misappropriated funds, disappearances, or hush-hush relationships, they don't leak, they evaporate. But even in Europe, where public scrutiny is stronger, royal estates benefit from legal protections that shield them from inspection. In the UK, for instance, the royal household is exempt from many labour and safety regulations that apply to normal employers. This creates an environment where internal problems can be handled internally. No oversight, no transparency, just quiet rearrangements and polite denials. And that's the real trick of royal architecture, not the grandeur, but the containment. These are buildings designed to absorb scandal and reflect dignity. Every corridor has a story. Some just haven't been told yet. Because the next time a palace window lights up during wartime, you might ask, who's inside and what are they really doing? Because when nations go to war, royals rarely stay idle. Some serve, some flee, and some vanish into the folds of secret operations and unspoken roles, written not into history books, but into classified files. 17. Royals and secret wartime activities. When nations go to war, monarchies are expected to project unity, resilience, and calm, like a flag that never burns, a statue that doesn't blink. Publicly, royal family members visit troops, pose solemnly in front of memorials, and give carefully rehearsed speeches about sacrifice. But behind the orchestrated photo ops and battlefield tours, there have always been royals playing far more clandestine roles, engaging in secret missions, covert diplomacy, or quiet acts of complicity that never made it into the official war diaries. The image of a monarch as a wartime leader is carefully cultivated. In Britain, King George VI became a symbol of steadfastness during the Blitz, choosing to remain in Buckingham Palace even as bombs fell nearby. But not all wartime royal actions were so cleanly heroic, and not all of them were meant for the history books. Take, for example, Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh. While his World War II naval service is widely known, less publicised are the coded communications and strategic roles he played behind the scenes. His connections to European royal families, some of which were deeply entangled in fascist regimes, placed him at the crossroads of intelligence, diplomacy, and suspicion. His sisters were married to German aristocrats, some with ties to the Nazi Party. Official biographies carefully step around this fact, framing it as unfortunate circumstance. But wartime intelligence agencies didn't always share that neutral view. Then there's the matter of unofficial channels, royals who were used as intermediaries between warring governments or intelligence agencies. Members of European royal families, often fluent in multiple languages and able to move across borders under diplomatic cover, became informal messengers, leveraging their status to carry sensitive information or gauge political sentiment abroad. These missions, rarely documented in official records, were useful precisely because they were deniable. In some cases, royals found themselves operating in more shadowed capacities. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, Britain's secret WWII sabotage unit, included aristocrats and royal associates trained in espionage, demolition, and code work. While not crowned royals, they operated under the radar of public awareness, often with palace knowledge, and in certain cases, palace connections. The line between socialite and spy blurred quickly when wartime loyalties were at stake. And not all royal wartime activities were noble. Some members of royalty were accused, sometimes credibly, of sympathizing with or even aiding enemy regimes. From Scandinavia to the Balkans, complex wartime allegiances meant that royals occasionally played both sides, hedging their bets to maintain dynastic survival regardless of the victor. These roles were quietly buried after the war ended, wrapped in diplomatic immunity and historical amnesia. Even post-war, royal involvement in intelligence hasn't vanished. Modern monarchies, especially in countries with active intelligence networks, are still briefed regularly on national security matters. Some have undergone discreet military or intelligence training, supposedly to prepare for ceremonial roles. But ceremonial doesn't usually include cyber defense simulations, crisis response protocols, or discrete strategy sessions with defense ministers. And while much of this is framed as tradition or preparation, it raises a deeper question. How much does the public really know about the role their royals play in times of crisis? Because if a royal family can move undetected through wartime intelligence circles, what else can they hide under the pretense of discretion? What about the battles that happen behind closed doors, not with weapons, but with memory, reputation, and the carefully polished illusion of perfect mental composure? 18. Royal family member addiction, mental health, and cover-ups. For institutions built on image, nothing is more dangerous than imperfection, especially when it affects the mind. Monarchies, with their obsessive devotion to composure and continuity, have historically gone to great lengths to conceal any sign of emotional turbulence or psychological distress within their own walls. In royal logic, a crown must never falter, even in private. And so, when a royal family member struggles with addiction, with depression, with breakdowns or behavioral spirals, the response has rarely been compassion. It has been containment. The British royal family, often seen as the blueprint for public stoicism, has its own long and quiet history of covering mental health issues. During much of the 20th century, this wasn't just taboo, it was considered a weakness that could jeopardize the credibility of the institution itself. The story of Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister, is often painted as glamorous rebellion. But beneath the diamonds and cigarette holders was a life marked by isolation, alcohol dependency, and prolonged mental and emotional instability. Official statements never addressed it directly. The public was told she was resting or unwell. Behind the scenes, staff reported erratic behavior and emotional collapse. Even more chilling is the story of the Queen's cousins, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, who were institutionalized for developmental disabilities in the mid-20th century and declared officially dead in public records while still alive. For decades, the royal family did not acknowledge their existence. Their reality, tucked away in a mental institution with almost no visitors, did not fit the narrative, so it was erased. Addiction, too, has long haunted royal households. In various monarchies around the world, from Europe to the Middle East, members of royal families have been linked to alcohol abuse, prescription drug dependency, and behavioral issues that were quietly passed off as stress or exhaustion. The goal has never been transparency or treatment. The goal has been discretion, and the cover-ups don't only concern direct heirs. Extended members of royal dynasties, cousins, siblings, in-laws, are often subject to internal damage control strategies when their personal challenges risk making headlines. This can include emergency retreats, discreet clinics abroad, or, in some cases, cutting them off entirely from the public-facing side of the family. If a royal becomes too unpredictable, they don't just lose appearances, they lose visibility altogether. What makes these cover-ups more complex today is the changing public attitude toward mental health. In recent years, younger royals have begun to speak more openly about psychological well-being. Campaigns have been launched, soundbites given, and yet the most serious cases, the ones involving institutional concealment or decades of silence, remain unacknowledged. Because even as the monarchy adapts to modern sensitivities, its reflex to protect the image of the crown over the individuals beneath it remains intact. And when that image is threatened not by scandal or sickness, but by forbidden love and its messy consequences, the instinct to hide grows stronger. Because sometimes what's being covered up isn't just a crisis, it's a person. One who was never meant to be seen, let alone remembered. 19. Hidden pets, mistresses and extramarital children. Among royalty, every monarchy runs on illusion. The illusion of harmony, restraint, moral superiority, and perhaps most importantly, the illusion that royal families are just like us, but slightly better dressed and infinitely more well-behaved. But history, if it teaches anything, reminds us that behind every crown is a trail of unacknowledged companions, private doors, and relationships that never made it into the official portraits. Because for centuries, royals have been entangled in relationships that were never meant for the record, and the evidence, whether in the form of a mysteriously well-kept pet, a quietly elevated courtier, or a child who belonged to a friend of the family, was dealt with accordingly. The tradition of royal mistresses is, ironically, one of the oldest and most openly hidden institutions in monarchy. In France, official mistresses were practically a role at court, complete with titles, palaces, and influence. Madame de Pompadour wielded more power than most ministers, but not every liaison was so publicly accepted. In Britain, the line between personal indulgence and constitutional embarrassment has always been razor-thin. Kings like Charles II and Edward VII had well-known mistresses, but the children that resulted were more carefully managed, acknowledged only when it was useful or when denial became impossible. And sometimes it wasn't the kings who kept secrets. Princesses, duchesses, and queens consort, expected to embody dignity and fidelity, occasionally had secrets of their own. these were covered up with even greater urgency. The double standard was not just social, it was institutional. A prince's indiscretion might become a footnote. A princess's could rewrite succession. The pets, believe it or not, sometimes tell their own story. Throughout history, royals have bestowed lavish gifts, titles, and estates on favored animals, or so the records say. But in some cases, these gifts were placeholders used to conceal the transfer of wealth or property to mistresses, illegitimate offspring, or quietly loyal servants. A racehorse with suspicious funding, a dog with its own estate, all perfectly legal and completely misleading. As for the children born from these unofficial unions, their fates varied. Some were brought into the royal household in other capacities, as wards, godchildren, or distant relatives raised by staff. Others were quietly sent abroad, given generous trusts, and instructed to disappear. Occasionally they reappeared years later, claiming their parentage with striking resemblances and paper trails. Most were ignored, their stories deemed too inconvenient to confirm or deny. The silence surrounding these relationships isn't accidental, it's structural. The monarchy depends on clean lines of inheritance, controlled narratives, and the public's belief in orderly descent. A mistress is a complication. A child is a threat. Even in modern times, attempts to bring these stories to light are met with denial, legal maneuvering, or carefully worded statements about privacy. But if the royal family can hide people, they can certainly hide assets. And not just jewelry or land with immense. We're talking entire fortunes, strategically tucked across borders, nestled in trusts, and managed in silence. Because what's more royal than secrecy? Only wealth, especially when no one knows where it went. 20. Secret wealth hidden abroad by royals publicly. Most royal families project an image of dignified frugality. They cut ribbons, open hospitals, and deliver carefully choreographed statements about service, duty, and the importance of national unity. Behind closed doors, however, the machinery of royal wealth operates by a different code, one written in offshore filings, private trusts, anonymous property holdings, and multi-jurisdictional bank accounts that would make a tax attorney dizzy. Royal wealth is often split into two categories, what's public and what's personal. The public part is easy to follow. Palaces maintained by taxpayers, ceremonial budgets, and stipends like the UK's sovereign grant. The personal part, however, is anything but transparent. It's here, in the grey area between inheritance and empire, that things get interesting, and in many cases, hidden. Take the revelations from the Paradise Papers in 2017. The leaked documents exposed how the Duchy of Lancaster, the private estate that provides income to the reigning British monarch, invested millions in offshore funds located in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda. These investments included holdings in controversial businesses, such as loan companies criticized for predatory practices. Official palace responses were vague. No laws were broken, they said, just prudent financial planning. That phrase, of course, carries a different weight when you're managing royal millions in a tax shelter most of your subjects will never see. And the British royals aren't the only ones with hidden ledgers. Across Europe and the Middle East, monarchies have used offshore companies to acquire properties in Paris, London, Geneva, and New York, often through opaque legal structures designed to conceal ownership. Shell companies, trusts, and nominee directors ensure that, on paper, the assets are far removed from royal hands. In reality, they're just a phone call away. In Gulf monarchies, sovereign wealth funds, often controlled directly or indirectly by royal family members, blur the line between state money and private fortune. Billions flow into foreign real estate, tech companies, sports teams, and luxury assets, with little to no accountability to the public. These investments are presented as national strategies, but the beneficiaries are frequently royal, and the structures that house them are designed for discretion. Even in countries with constitutional monarchies, royal families often enjoy exemptions from transparency laws. In the UK, for example, royal wills are sealed, sometimes for over a century, making it nearly impossible to track how wealth is passed down or divided. Requests for financial disclosures are routinely denied under the banner of protecting the dignity of the crown. The irony, of course, is that the very act of hiding invites the question, dignity for whom? Sometimes the secrecy isn't about hiding wrongdoing, it's about maintaining mystique. Monarchies trade on image, and the image of a benevolent royal devoted to public service doesn't pair well with headlines about offshore accounts and anonymous villas in the south of France. Even the hint of hidden fortune raises the spectre of inequality, corruption, or entitlement, words monarchies desperately try to avoid. But hidden wealth has consequences beyond perception. It means assets are kept out of reach during national crises. It means influence is wielded without accountability. And it raises uncomfortable questions about how power is sustained and protected when it's backed not just by tradition, but by invisible money moving silently across borders. Because when a royal can quietly move millions, what else can they move? Ideas, legislation, even governments. And what happens when influence stops being symbolic and starts shaping policy from the shadows, where no crown is visible, but every decision bears its mark? 21. Royals influencing national politics via hidden channels. Royal families are often described as above politics. That phrase gets repeated so often it becomes self-evident. A mantra meant to comfort the public and preserve the illusion that monarchy is purely ceremonial. But if you pull back the curtain even slightly, the picture becomes much murkier, because being above politics is not the same as being outside of it. And when power comes without accountability, influence becomes a private matter, and royal influence in particular has a long history of operating in the shadows. Despite the pomp and pageantry, modern monarchies, particularly constitutional ones, are not just figureheads. In subtle and sometimes legally protected ways, royals continue to shape legislation, block reforms, and nudge policy outcomes behind closed doors. They don't need to stand for election. They don't even need to say anything publicly. All they have to do is lean on the right ministers at the right time, and occasionally exercise powers most people don't even realize they still possess. In the United Kingdom, for instance, one of the most quietly controversial mechanisms is known as King's Consent, previously Queen's Consent. It's a legal requirement that certain parliamentary bills must be presented to the reigning monarch for approval before they can even be debated. Officially, it's a formality, a dusty relic of constitutional procedure. But leaked documents and investigative reports have revealed that it has in fact been used to influence and alter legislation. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, the Crown vetted over 1,000 bills. In several cases, changes were made to legislation after palace intervention, including laws related to land use, taxation, pensions, and even the transparency of royal finances themselves. One particularly notable example involved Prince Charles, now King Charles III, who lobbied for exemptions that would allow his Duchy of Cornwall estate to avoid certain environmental regulations. It worked. The key here isn't whether the changes were drastic, it's that they happened in secret. There's no public record of these interventions unless a leak occurs. No vote, no debate, just influence exercised under the polite cover of tradition. This pattern isn't unique to Britain. In other constitutional monarchies, such as those in the Netherlands, Spain, and Scandinavia, royals have been known to meet privately with politicians, offer guidance, or weigh in during times of constitutional uncertainty. These meetings are rarely documented in detail, and any mention in the press is brushed aside as routine or harmless. But monarchs aren't ordinary citizens. Their opinions carry weight, especially when voiced behind closed doors beyond scrutiny. And it's not just legislation. Royals often hold sway over public appointments, military honours, diplomatic ceremonies, and the soft politics of national mood. A raised eyebrow at the right dinner can send signals that ripple through entire cabinets. A well-placed phrase in a Christmas speech can double as a coded message. The public sees the smile and the wave. What they don't see is the influence. Why does it matter? Because monarchies claim to be neutral institutions. Their legitimacy rests on the idea that they do not interfere, that they stand as unifying figures above the fray. But if they are actively shaping the rules under which everyone else must live, then their neutrality is a myth. A comforting myth, perhaps, but a myth nonetheless. And if power can be exercised invisibly in the corridors of Parliament, what happens in the even older corridors, the ones where royal bloodlines are preserved not through democracy or policy, but through centuries of arranged unions, some far darker than tradition would like to admit? Because the next secret doesn't involve legislation, it involves lineage and the ways it has been manipulated in silence. 22. Hidden scandals of incest, forced marriages and child brides. Royal bloodlines are, by design, exclusive. For centuries, the idea was simple. Keep the blood pure, the power contained, and the throne within the family. But that logic, rigid, generational, and cloaked in divine right, often led to arrangements that were less romantic than strategic, less consensual than coerced, and less ethical than history is willing to admit. Beneath the ceremonial grandeur of royal weddings lies a disturbing pattern of marriages arranged not for love or compatibility, but for control. And sometimes that control came at a staggering human cost. The history of royal incest is not an aberration. It is, in many dynasties, an open architectural feature. Among the Egyptian pharaohs, brother-sister unions were institutionalized, justified by theology and reinforced by law. The Ptolemaic dynasty, including the famous Cleopatra, carried the tradition to its logical extreme, marrying within the family to keep power tightly bound. While this may feel like ancient history, the broader theme never really vanished. In medieval and early modern Europe, cousin marriages, sometimes first cousins, sometimes double cousins, were the norm among royals. The Habsburgs of Austria and Spain became a living illustration of genetic decline through generational inbreeding, culminating in Charles II of Spain, whose jawline became a symbol of dynastic collapse. These marriages weren't merely tolerated, they were encouraged. The rationale was pragmatic. Uniting two branches of a royal house preserved claims to thrones, reinforced treaties, and minimized the threat of external influence. But what was gained politically was often lost ethically and medically. Generations of congenital disorders, infertility, and mental health crises were brushed aside as unfortunate byproducts of duty. And it wasn't just incest, it was age. Throughout royal history, marrying off young girls, sometimes barely into adolescence, was considered standard practice. The marriages were legal, blessed by courts and clergy alike, and hailed as triumphs of diplomacy. The girls involved, however, were often treated as pawns, shipped across continents, betrothed to men decades older, and expected to produce heirs before they were old enough to rule anything themselves. In some cases, the marriage was formalized years before it was consummated. In others, no such delays were observed. These practices weren't confined to Europe. In Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, royal marriages were tools of consolidation, mechanisms to forge alliances, absorb rival lineages, and cement tribal or religious legitimacy. The individuals involved had little say in the matter. Defying a royal match was not an act of rebellion, it was treason. The secrecy around these arrangements comes not from their existence, many were proudly announced, but from the consequences, the emotional trauma, the hidden illnesses, the unspoken suffering of young brides or isolated princes. Modern royal institutions tend to gloss over this history, presenting past marriages as quaint or ceremonial, omitting the more unsettling realities that underpin them. And while contemporary monarchies have largely moved away from such overt arrangements, the echoes remain. Bloodlines are still monitored, relationships are still scrutinized, suitable partners are still vetted behind palace doors. The vocabulary has changed. It's now about image, stability, tradition, but the instinct remains the same. Control the narrative, control the future. Because when marriage becomes a political tool, it stops being about people and starts being about power. And that power, once consolidated, can be used for far more than matchmaking. It can be used to silence, not just lovers, but entire populations. Especially when what's being hidden isn't who someone married, but what their rule did to the people beneath them. 23. Cover-ups of royal involvement in human rights abuses. When we think of royalty, we often picture them as distant figureheads, smiling benignly from balconies, cutting ceremonial ribbons, and offering seasonal reflections about unity and peace. But that public image, so carefully curated, often stands in stark contrast to the roles some royal families have played in more troubling chapters of history. Beyond the castles and carriages, beyond the national anthems and televised weddings, there are darker stories, ones involving repression, coercion, and the systematic abuse of power. And in many cases, these stories were buried just as deliberately as any scandal involving a lover or a secret heir. In absolute monarchies, where royal authority is not ceremonial but legislative, judicial and military, the line between the crown and state-sanctioned violence becomes dangerously thin. In these contexts, royal decisions have carried, and continue to carry, the weight of life and death. Political dissidents disappear, protests are suppressed, laws are enforced not with debate but with decree. And yet, the international spotlight rarely shines on the person at the top of the pyramid. Monarchs, after all, are still seen in many circles as apolitical, even when their rule is anything but. In the Gulf region, for example, royal families dominate the political and legal structures of their nations. They appoint ministers, oversee security services, and directly control large portions of national wealth. And when allegations emerge of labor abuses, censorship, unlawful detentions, or harsh crackdowns on activism, the public face of the monarchy remains curiously untouched. Statements are issued by state ministries, inquiries are launched that never publish results, and the royals continue to host international events and diplomatic dinners, their reputations carefully shielded by layers of protocol and plausible deniability. But plausible doesn't mean innocent. There have been documented cases where royal guards, palace security forces, or inner circle advisors have been implicated in acts that would spark international outrage if committed by anyone else. The difference is that monarchies often enjoy immunity, not just legal, but cultural. Criticizing a king or prince is considered taboo in many societies, punishable by law in some. This silence becomes a cloak, allowing abuses to go unacknowledged and unchallenged. Even in constitutional monarchies, where royals no longer rule directly, past involvement in colonial administration and imperial expansion has left a trail of human rights violations, land dispossession, forced labor, and political subjugation, often whitewashed in royal biographies. Members of royal families frequently served as colonial governors, commanders, or envoys, overseeing systems that were exploitative by design. These roles are usually framed as service to the empire, with little mention of the policies implemented or the populations affected. What's more, modern monarchies have often resisted calls for formal apologies or reparations. The rationale? The royal family is a symbol, not a policymaker, a figurehead, not an enforcer. But when that symbol has profited from or presided over systems that harmed millions, the symbolism itself becomes part of the problem. Behind every gilded portrait and national anthem lies a political structure, and for many royals, that structure was built on the control of others, and once that control is normalized, it can mutate, not just into silence, but into partnership. Because power doesn't fade in isolation, it adapts, and in the shadows of royal courts, it has sometimes found common cause with far more dangerous forces, ones that operate not through crowns and thrones, but through darker hidden networks that few would ever suspect. 24. Royals and secret liaison with organized crime or illicit business monarchies, at least on paper, exist to symbolize national virtue. They are supposed to represent the best of a country, dignity, continuity, and public service woven into a crown. But real life, unlike royal charters, rarely aligns so neatly. And behind the polished image, the history of royal households is dotted with discreet and occasionally dangerous entanglements with less than legal enterprises. Whether through willful partnership, naive proximity, or carefully ignored warning signs, some royals have drifted far closer to the world of organized crime than their official biographies would ever dare suggest. One of the key reasons these connections have remained hidden for so long is that royal privilege operates as a force field. Where an ordinary person might be investigated or exposed, a royal is often protected, not only by law, but by tradition, institutional loyalty, and the belief that the throne must remain unsullied, even if those surrounding it are not. Over the decades, scattered reports have emerged linking royal family members, particularly those outside the direct line of succession, to shady business ventures, questionable real estate deals, and strange partnerships with figures operating just outside the bounds of legality. These aren't fairy tales, they're contractual arrangements, offshore companies, and middlemen with quiet backgrounds and loud bank accounts. In some cases, royals have been used as social leverage by criminals. A handshake at a charity event, a photo opportunity at a polo match, a dinner invitation extended through a third party. These moments, while seemingly harmless, offer enormous reputational capital for people who move in circles where appearance is currency. Being seen with a prince or princess, even peripherally, can provide the illusion of legitimacy. And when that illusion is tied to money laundering, land grabs, or illicit trade, it becomes a shield no court can easily penetrate. In other instances, the relationships run deeper. Members of royalty, particularly those cut off from state funding or driven by personal ambition, have been known to attach their names to suspicious ventures, oil deals in unstable regions, mining contracts with unclear terms, luxury developments funded by money of uncertain origin. These connections are often dressed in diplomatic language, economic cooperation, international investment, but the reality beneath the paperwork tells a more complicated story. One high-profile example involved a European royal accused of accepting consulting fees from a businessman later convicted of corruption. The payments were routed through shell companies, and while the royal denied wrongdoing, the pattern mirrored classic tactics used by organized networks to buy influence without leaving fingerprints. Even when formal charges are never filed, the stench of impropriety clings because royals operate in a space where access is power, and access, in the right hands, is worth more than gold. In that world, introductions are transactions, and reputations can be rented by the hour. Yet these stories rarely break through the palace gates. Legal threats, friendly media, and public reverence keep the worst details at bay. Most scandals die quietly, buried under vague headlines and no comment statements. The royal image remains intact. The partners disappear. The money moves on. But this kind of secrecy breeds something more than embarrassment. It breeds impunity. And when you're protected from consequences long enough, even the most powerful families begin to believe they're untouchable. Which may explain why, in some royal households, the greatest secret isn't what they did, it's what they were willing to hide when illness, disability, or imperfection knocked quietly at the throne room door. 25. Secret medical conditions and disabilities hidden by royalty is a performance. Every balcony wave, every state dinner, every stiffly recited speech is part of a carefully choreographed spectacle meant to project strength, stability, and continuity. Monarchs aren't supposed to cough, stumble, or falter, and they are certainly not supposed to be ill, incapacitated, or, in the eyes of history's more ruthless handlers, imperfect. This expectation has created one of the quietest and most enduring traditions within monarchy, the systematic concealment of medical conditions and disabilities, often not for the sake of privacy, but to preserve the illusion of flawless sovereignty. Throughout history, royal families have hidden everything from physical ailments and cognitive impairments to degenerative diseases and congenital disorders. The rationale has always been the same. A monarch must not appear vulnerable. Vulnerability invites questions, and questions, especially about succession or capability, can be more threatening to a monarchy than any sword or scandal. One of the most infamous examples is the long-suppressed story of King George III of Britain, the mad king who lost the American colonies. For centuries, his mental illness was treated as an uncomfortable footnote. Official court records spoke only in vague terms of melancholy or nervous complaints. It wasn't until the 20th century that historians began to piece together the likelihood that George III suffered from a serious and recurring psychiatric condition, possibly bipolar disorder or porphyria. During his episodes, he would speak for hours without pause, write in frantic, illegible script, and become incoherent in public. The government responded not with transparency, but with regency and silence. He was, in effect, ruled around. But perhaps the most disturbing instance of concealment came in the 20th century with the aforementioned case of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, cousins of Queen Elizabeth II. The two women, both born with developmental disabilities, were quietly institutionalized in a state-run hospital and listed as dead in the peerage guidebooks, despite being very much alive. For decades, they lived in near anonymity, reportedly receiving almost no visitors. The official line was that their condition was a private family matter. The unspoken truth, they were considered a liability to the royal image. Similar patterns emerge across other monarchies. In Spain, King Alfonso XIII was said to suffer from medical complications that were never publicly acknowledged during his reign. In Tsarist Russia, the young heir Alexei Romanov's hemophilia was a closely guarded state secret. His condition, a result of royal intermarriage, not only threatened his life, but also the stability of the imperial dynasty. Rasputin's infamous rise was tied directly to this medical secret, as the mystic's influence was welcomed by a desperate royal couple hoping for a cure no doctor could offer. Even in the modern era, details about royal health are managed with extreme caution. Press releases are vague, diagnoses are delayed, treatments are rarely disclosed, and when disability is involved, whether physical or neurological, the instinct is often to quietly relocate the individual to a less public role or out of view entirely. This pattern reflects more than just a desire for privacy. It reveals a monarchy's deepest insecurity, the idea that their legitimacy depends on physical and mental perfection. And when that illusion cracks, the institution would rather erase the individual than confront the reality. But what happens when the cracks aren't medical, but political, when the threat to the throne doesn't come from within the body, but from within the bloodline itself? Because in royal history, even kinship isn't always a guarantee of safety, especially when the crown is at stake, and coups are better staged in silence than in spectacle. 26. Hidden coups or dethronements within royal houses. For institutions built on continuity, monarchies are surprisingly prone to abrupt endings. But the most fascinating royal overthrows aren't the loud, bloody ones, they're the quiet ones, the subtle reshuffles, the disappearances with diplomatic packaging. the polite exiles that arrive not with mobs and guillotines, but with carefully worded press statements and last-minute flights to other countries. These are the coups no one calls coups, and they've happened more often and more recently than royal publicists would like you to believe. Within royal households, the idea of loyalty is often confused with obedience, and when a monarch or a powerful heir begins to diverge from the script, the machinery of palace politics can be swift and surgical. Sometimes it comes from within the family itself. Other times, it's orchestrated by politicians, generals, or foreign powers who prefer a more compliant figurehead. Either way, the result is the same: a ruler removed, a story rewritten, and an entire population gently nudged toward forgetting. Consider the case of King Farouk of Egypt. He was overthrown in 1952 during a military coup that rebranded itself as a revolution, led by a group of young officers, including Gamal Abdel Nasser. Farouk, known for his lavish lifestyle and rumored mismanagement, was forced to abdicate in favor of his infant son. He was packed off to Italy aboard a royal yacht, and just like that, 150 years of Muhammad Ali dynasty rule came to a halt, dressed up as modernization. The monarchy was abolished 2 years later, but the transition was smooth, almost suspiciously so. The press called it progress. Behind closed doors, it was a quiet power grab dressed in nationalist robes. In Thailand, royal succession has long been the subject of carefully guarded secrecy. When King Bhumibol Adulyadej passed in 2016, after 70 years on the throne, the transition to his son Maha Vajiralongkorn was anything but straightforward. Behind the scenes, military leaders and palace courtiers reportedly negotiated intensely over the succession timeline, messaging, and constitutional power. The new king delayed his ascension for months, officially to mourn, but unofficially analysts speculated to consolidate leverage. The monarchy remained intact, but the mechanics of control had clearly shifted. There have also been instances where royal figures vanished from public life without formal abdication. In some monarchies, this is a form of internal exile, not unlike a corporate leave of absence that slowly becomes permanent. A royal falls out of favor, is quietly removed from public duties, and is later remembered only in whispers. In some cases, they're sent abroad under the guise of personal health, education, or diplomacy. The reality is often far more political. Then there are the familial dethronements, internal power plays where one royal faction pushes out another. In Saudi Arabia, the 2017 political purge saw high-profile princes arrested or sidelined in what was officially called an anti-corruption sweep. But observers widely interpreted it as a consolidation of power by then Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Palatial intrigue, inheritance disputes, and backroom deals, all without a single bullet fired or official dethronement declared. What makes these modern coups so insidious is how effectively they are disguised. There are no trial transcripts, no exile memoirs, just a reshuffling of titles, a new face on the postage stamp, and a rewritten narrative approved by royal PR teams. And if royalty can rewrite their own present, imagine what they can do to their past. Especially when it involves the most dangerous secret of all, not who they are, but who they once pretended not to be. Because sometimes the greatest threat to the crown isn't a rival army or rebellious parliament. It's a quiet change of faith hidden behind closed chapel doors. 27. Royals and secret religious conversions. A monarch, in theory, embodies the soul of a nation, and in many cases that soul is tied to religion. Whether crowned under crosses, anointed by high priests, or draped in centuries-old symbols of divine right, royal families have long positioned themselves as not just political leaders, but spiritual exemplars. Which is why, when a royal strays from the officially sanctioned faith, or worse, converts in secret, it's not treated as a personal choice, it's treated as a crisis. In some monarchies, religion is not just tradition, it's law. The British monarch, for instance, is not allowed to be Catholic. The sovereign is both the head of state and the supreme governor of the Church of England. The religious affiliation isn't optional, it's constitutional, which is what makes even the rumor of religious deviation such a sensitive subject. There's more than personal belief at stake, there's legitimacy. Throughout history, there have been quiet instances where royals considered or committed religious conversion. These stories, when not completely erased, have often been reframed as spiritual curiosity or political maneuvering. But the truth behind them is often far more personal and far more dangerous. One of the most famous and controversial examples involved Princess Diana. In the final years of her life, after her divorce from Prince Charles, speculation swirled that she had considered converting to Islam while romantically involved with Dodi Fayed. Whether or not this was true, the mere possibility ignited panic in the press and discomfort within royal circles. A Muslim stepfather to the future king, a mother of the heir publicly changing faith. It was a narrative the monarchy wasn't prepared to explain or allow to unfold. In earlier centuries, secret conversions were often tied to political exile. During the reign of Catholic monarchs in Protestant countries, or vice versa, it was not uncommon for disgraced royals to adopt new religions while abroad. These acts were usually kept out of official records as they threatened the public's perception of divine alignment. A converted monarch, in the eyes of tradition, became a broken symbol, and symbols don't get second chances. In the Middle East, where monarchies are frequently bound by both religious authority and political power, conversion is not just taboo, it's often illegal. There have been murmurs, unconfirmed but persistent, of princes and princesses who adopted private spiritual beliefs that diverged from national religious orthodoxy. In such cases, the response has typically been containment, a reassignment, a sudden absence from public life. The official line remains unchanged. The unofficial reality is locked away. And it's not always about full conversion. Sometimes it's about marrying someone of another religion. In many royal houses, even today, such unions require quiet negotiations. Pre-nuptial agreements involving religious education of children, or in some cases, outright denial of the relationship. Love, when it crosses theological lines, becomes politically radioactive. The core fear, as always, is that faith translates to loyalty. If a royal is seen to have pledged themselves to a different god, does that mean they've turned their back on their people, on their duty, on the very system that holds the institution together? So the solution, historically, has been simple: deny, delay, and when necessary, disappear the story. Because a royal can recover from scandal, but from apostasy, not always. And if faith can be erased so neatly from the record, what else can be hidden? What happens when the damage done within the palace walls isn't philosophical, but personal, intimate, and deeply wounding? The kind of damage people whisper about, but never fully name. 28. Hidden sexual abuse or misconduct within royal households. Of all the secrets royal families have buried, perhaps the most painful and most aggressively hidden are those involving misconduct behind palace walls. These are not just lapses in etiquette or violations of royal protocol. They are human harms, inflicted in silence, protected by privilege, and shielded by an institutional reflex to preserve image above all else. When allegations of misconduct arise within a monarchy, particularly those involving abuse, the response is rarely transparency. Instead, it follows a script honed over centuries: denial, deflection, controlled messaging, and legal insulation. The goal isn't justice, the goal is containment. One of the most visible examples of this dynamic in recent history is the case involving Prince Andrew, Duke of York. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender, led to one of the most explosive public relations crises the British monarchy has faced in decades. Accusations were made, photographs surfaced, interviews were given, and still the official royal response was tepid and meticulously worded. The palace distanced itself without condemning him. Internal roles were quietly removed, doors were closed, but no one inside ever answered them. The most telling part of the scandal wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. No formal apology, no internal investigation made public. Just a slow, cautious maneuver to remove Andrew from the spotlight while keeping the institution intact. And it worked. In the end, the story faded from the front pages and the monarchy remained untouched. Not exonerated, not accountable, just untouched. But Prince Andrew is not the only example. Throughout history, royal households across the world have maintained layers of protection around their members that few other institutions can match. Accusations of misconduct, whether involving palace staff, courtiers, or others in the royal orbit, are often resolved internally, if at all. Victims are offered settlements accompanied by strict non-disclosure agreements. Cases are handled not through public courts, but through private lawyers. And the press, managed with precision. The culture of silence is not unique to royalty, but monarchy reinforces it with ceremonial authority and inherited reverence. In many countries, laws explicitly shield royal figures from prosecution. In others, media outlets hesitate to pursue damaging stories about royal households for fear of losing access or incurring public backlash. And perhaps most disturbingly, many victims have no clear path to justice. When the accused lives behind a wall of diplomatic immunity, historical loyalty, and national symbolism, the system offers little in the way of recourse. These are the stories that don't make it into official biographies or public commemorations. They are buried in settlements, redacted from archives and lost in the shadow of deference. But no amount of ceremony can erase the cost. Because when power protects itself at the expense of the powerless, the damage doesn't just stain the present, it corrupts the past. And if those wounds are never acknowledged, the same silence becomes precedent. Which is how, in the next room over, deals are signed, not with justice in mind, but preservation. Deals that gave away more than land, deals that rewrote entire histories, quietly, permanently. 29. Hidden deals with colonial or foreign powers. Monarchies have long relied on the theatre of permanence, flags, anthems, and thrones polished until they gleam with imagined nobility. But when you look closely at how empires were actually built, it becomes clear that the foundation wasn't gold or divine right. It was paperwork. Treaties signed in back rooms, lands exchanged for loyalty, rights quietly sold for personal advantage, and across the centuries, royal families have cut secret deals with colonial and foreign powers that reshaped borders, erased peoples, and redrew the world, all while preserving their own power. These weren't always dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they were billed as strategic compromises, alliances for the good of the realm. But peel back the layers of diplomatic phrasing, and what you often find is a pattern of calculated silence. Royal figures, desperate to hold on to their crowns or expand their influence, entered into confidential agreements with invading empires or hostile regimes. These deals often handed over enormous political and economic concessions in exchange for thrones that would otherwise have crumbled. In Africa, for instance, several traditional monarchs during the height of European colonization signed treaties with colonial powers that handed over control of entire regions. These were not always informed or consensual contracts. Some were forged under pressure, others under deception, and many with no understanding of what was truly being ceded. In return, these monarchs were allowed to remain as ceremonial rulers, stripped of real power, but cloaked in the illusion of sovereignty. The royal lineage was preserved, the land, however, was not. In South Asia, similar stories played out. Under the British Raj, many Indian princely states entered into secret arrangements with the British Crown, agreeing to maintain colonial law and order in exchange for continued recognition, titles, and financial stipends. These rulers kept their palaces, their jewels, and their status while their people labored under foreign rule. In public, these royals were portrayed as allies. In practice, they were often buffers between the empire and unrest, conveniently loyal, conspicuously silent. The Middle East, too, offers its share of veiled transactions. In the early 20th century, as oil emerged as a new form of geopolitical power, European monarchies and industrialists struck quiet deals with emerging royal families. In exchange for infrastructure, weapons, and recognition, Western powers received access to vast reserves of oil and influence. The agreements were binding, the transparency optional. And even today, archives continue to reveal how certain royal households benefited from the aftershocks of those deals: land leases, military alliances, corporate partnerships with vague origins. The past remains sealed not just because it's distant, but because it's still profitable. These weren't simply mistakes of another era. They were deliberate trades, land for legacy, sovereignty for symbolism. And while the public was told the crown stood for unity, behind closed doors, maps were redrawn, not with swords, but signatures. Which brings us to the final and most disorienting secret. When a royal family chooses to bury the truth so deeply, they don't just lose history, they erase people, sometimes entire lives. Siblings who vanish from memory, heirs who never were, ghosts walking the margins of dynastic history, waiting for someone to ask why their name was never spoken. 30. Secret identity changes, hidden siblings or ghost heirs. Every royal lineage is, in theory, a straight line. Clean, well-documented, and sacred. Birthright is everything. The whole institution depends on the idea that the right person sits on the throne, that they were born into it, groomed for it, chosen not by merit, but by destiny. Which is why, when that line is disrupted by a sibling who suddenly disappears, an heir who was never acknowledged, or a child who was declared dead but wasn't, the entire structure begins to look less like a family tree and more like a script rewritten in real time. The phenomenon of the ghost heir, someone born into a royal family but erased from official records, is more common than it should be. Sometimes it's about medical conditions. Other times it's about legitimacy, gender, politics, or scandal. In all cases, it's about control. The palace decides who counts, who appears in the portrait, who inherits, and who is quietly forgotten. One of the most unsettling examples comes again from the British royal family, with the case of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II. Both women were born with developmental disabilities and were institutionalized from a young age. Their existence was kept from public knowledge for decades. More shockingly, official genealogies listed them as deceased while they were still alive. When journalists eventually uncovered the truth, the royal response was muted, detached, and notably absent of accountability. The message was clear: some lives did not fit the narrative, but this wasn't an isolated anomaly. In royal history, inconvenient siblings have been quietly sent to convents, country estates, or foreign lands. Their names vanish from official records. Their images disappear from palace archives. Sometimes they're rebranded, a cousin instead of a sister, a ward instead of a child. All while the line of succession marches on untroubled. There have also been cases of deliberate identity changes, royals who assumed false names or fabricated deaths to escape political threat, religious tension, or personal ruin. In revolutionary France, rumors persisted that Louis XVI, the young son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, survived the revolution and lived out his life under a new name. In Russia, the legend of Anastasia Romanov, the Duchess who may have escaped execution, captivated the world for nearly a century. Though DNA eventually disproved it, the myth lived because it touched a deeper truth. Royal families do lose people, and they don't always explain how or why. What makes these erasures so insidious is the intentionality. These weren't bureaucratic oversights, they were acts of narrative engineering. Decisions to sculpt a legacy at the expense of individuals. And once a person has been officially forgotten, it's difficult, sometimes impossible, to recover the truth. Because monarchy isn't just about who rules, it's about who's remembered, and more disturbingly, who is not. In the end, the greatest royal mystery may not be about power, wealth, or scandal, but about how many stories were erased so the official version could survive. And somewhere, behind the portraits and polished biographies, those stories still wait.